Mansa Musa's name now echoed from West Africa to the map-making workshops of Europe. But a king cannot spend his empire's future on a single journey without consequence. And the true test of his legacy was only beginning. He built one of the greatest centers of learning the medieval world had ever seen. He put an entire continent on the map of global consciousness. And yet, within a few generations of his death, the empire of Mansa Musa, the richest person who ever lived, would fracture, shrink, and eventually be swallowed by rival powers, its wealth scattered, its records lost or destroyed, its very existence nearly erased from the history books written by the empires that followed. How does the fortune of the richest man in human history simply disappear? And why, 7 centuries later, do economists and historians still argue about exactly how rich he actually was, with modern estimates ranging so wildly that some refuse to even attach a dollar figure to his name? This is the final chapter in the story of Mansa Musa. The golden age he built, the empire that could not hold, and the astonishing modern reckoning with just how wealthy one man could be. When Mansa Musa returned to his empire following his pilgrimage, he brought with him not just a transformed international reputation, but the physical and intellectual raw materials to reshape his own capital cities. Timbuktu, already an established trading post before his reign, entered its most celebrated golden age under his patronage. With the guidance of the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, the city saw the construction of the Jingareber Mosque, a striking structure built using fired mud brick techniques imported from North Africa, blended with local materials and building traditions. This mosque still stands in Timbuktu today, nearly 7 centuries later, a rare physical monument to the empire's golden age that has survived the passage of time, wars, and the encroaching desert. But architecture was only part of Musa's legacy. Perhaps more significant in the long run was his investment in scholarship. Musa is credited with expanding Timbuktu's reputation as a center of Islamic learning, attracting scholars, judges, and students from across North and West Africa. Manuscripts and books, purchased and commissioned during and after his pilgrimage, flowed into the city's growing collection of libraries and religious schools. This scholarly tradition would continue to flourish for generations after Musa's death, eventually giving rise to institutions like the University of Sankore, and to a manuscript culture so extensive that, centuries later, hundreds of thousands of surviving West African manuscripts, covering subjects from astronomy to law to medicine, would be rediscovered by modern historians and preserved as one of the great intellectual treasures of African history, standing as powerful evidence against colonial-era myths that Africa lacked written scholarly traditions before European contact. Under Musa's continued rule, which lasted until his death around 1337, the Mali Empire reached the height of its territorial and economic power. Contemporary accounts describe an empire that stretched across a vast portion of West Africa, incorporating dozens of vassal states and controlling the crucial trans-Saharan trade routes that had made it wealthy in the first place. Diplomatic relations extended as far as Morocco and Egypt, and Mali's reputation for wealth, stability, and scholarship made it one of the most respected powers in the broader Islamic world. Yet even at its height, the seeds of the empire's eventual decline were already present, largely rooted in the same succession uncertainties that had brought Musa to power in the first place. Mali's system of governance relied heavily on the personal authority and competence of its ruling Mansa, and the empire lacked a fully stable, institutionalized mechanism for ensuring consistently capable succession. After Musa's death, the throne passed to his son, Magan I, whose reign was markedly less successful. According to surviving accounts, the empire suffered military setbacks during this period, including raids by the Mossi kingdoms to the south, and some erosion of central authority began to set in. Later Mansas, including Musa's brother Suleiman, managed periods of relative stabilization and even further diplomatic and scholarly engagement. the famous North African traveler Ibn Battuta visited Mali during Suleiman's reign and left behind one of the only detailed eyewitness accounts of the empire's internal workings, describing both its impressive order and justice, and elements of court life that struck him as unusual by the standards of other Islamic societies he had visited. But the underlying pattern of succession disputes, court intrigue, and gradually weakening central control over the empire's furthest provinces continued to intensify over subsequent decades. By the 15th century, roughly a century after Musa's death, Mali's grip on its vast trading network had substantially weakened. Vassal states and tributary regions along the empire's periphery began asserting greater independence, and rival powers began to challenge Mali's dominance over the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade that had been the very foundation of its wealth. The most significant of these rising challengers was the Songhai Empire, centered along the Niger River to the east. Under ambitious rulers, most notably Sunni Ali and later Askia Muhammad, Songhai gradually eclipsed Mali as the dominant power in the region, absorbing key trading cities, including Timbuktu itself, into its own expanding territory by the late 15th century. Mali did not vanish overnight. It persisted in a diminished regional form for generations afterward, its former glory reduced to a shadow of its 14th century peak, gradually losing relevance as new trade patterns, new regional powers, and eventually European maritime trade routes reshaped the economic geography of West Africa entirely. The arrival of Portuguese ships along the West African coast in the following centuries began to redirect trade away from the ancient trans-Saharan caravan routes that had made empires like Mali and, later, Songhai so extraordinarily wealthy, toward new coastal trading arrangements that would eventually become entangled with the tragic history of the transatlantic slave trade, a devastating turn in West African history that lies beyond the scope of Mansa Musa's own story, but one that fundamentally altered the region's trajectory in the centuries that followed. For a long period afterward, particularly during the era of European colonialism, the history of pre-colonial African empires like Mali was frequently minimized, distorted, or outright ignored in Western historical narratives, part of a broader pattern of erasure that portrayed the African continent as lacking in complex political and economic history prior to European contact. It was only through the survival of medieval Arabic chronicles, the physical endurance of structures like the Djinguereber Mosque, the rediscovery of Timbuktu's manuscript collections, and the patient work of modern historians, both African and international, that the true scale of Mali's achievement and of Mansa Musa's extraordinary reign has been restored to its rightful place in global history. Which brings us to the question that gives this documentary its title. Was Mansa Musa truly the richest person who ever lived? In the early 21st century, this question moved from academic discussion into mainstream popular culture, largely due to a widely circulated 2012 article and subsequent economic estimates that attempted to translate Musa's wealth into modern currency. These estimates, often citing figures in the range of hundreds of billions of dollars, have been widely reproduced across media outlets and educational content ever since. However, it is important, in the interest of historical accuracy, to understand exactly how uncertain these figures really are. Modern economic historians who specialize in this period are, in fact, quite skeptical of any precise dollar figure attached to Mansa Musa's wealth. The core problem is one of fundamental measurement. Musa's wealth was not held as personal liquid currency in the way a modern billionaire's stock portfolio can be valued. It was, in large part, control over an entire empire's gold-producing territory and trade network. Wealth that belonged, in a meaningful sense, to the state and its economic system as much as to the man himself. Converting 14th-century control over an entire regional gold supply into a single modern dollar figure requires so many layers of assumption and approximation that serious economic historians generally decline to offer a specific number at all, even as popular media continues to circulate estimates that vary enormously, from tens of billions to over $400 billion, depending entirely on the assumptions used. What can be said with much greater confidence And what makes the claim genuinely compelling despite the uncertainty around any specific number is the relative and structural argument. No other individual in recorded history is documented as having controlled a share of global gold production comparable to what Mansa Musa commanded, and no other individual's personal spending is documented as having visibly destabilized the economy of a major world city for over a decade, simply through the act of passing through it. Modern billionaires, whatever the size of their fortunes on paper, do not possess this kind of singular, economy-bending influence over a global commodity. It is this structural, relative dominance, not a precise, verifiable net worth figure, that leads most serious historians to agree that if there is a single strongest historical candidate for the title of the richest person who ever lived, it is Mansa Musa of Mali. His legacy, then, is not really a number at all. It is the story of an empire built on controlled scarcity and trade dominance, a pilgrimage that reshaped the economic and cartographic understanding of an entire era, a golden age of scholarship whose manuscripts still survive in Timbuktu's libraries today, and a reminder that some of history's greatest fortunes are not measured in the currency of any single century, but in the scale of the world they were powerful enough to change. 700 years after his caravan crossed the Sahara carrying more gold than most of the medieval world had ever seen in one place, Mansa Musa's story endures, not as a fixed number in an economic ledger, but as a lasting demonstration of what unmatched control over a scarce resource can mean for a single human life. Empires rise and fracture. Gold moves from hand to hand across centuries. But the mosque he commissioned still stands in Timbuktu. The manuscripts his scholars gathered still survive in its libraries. And the question he unintentionally posed to history, just how rich can one person truly become, remains, 7 centuries later, without a settled answer. Perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all for the richest person who ever lived.